Well, hello everyone. I think we are live right now. My name is Caroline Biel. I run the Ontario Young Birders Instagram page. I'm a lifelong birder and I'm really excited because this year is the start of the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. And this is a really awesome, I'll let Mike talk more about what it is, but it's a really exciting initiative and it will be really important going forward. We have lost so many birds so far. There was a recent study that came out that showed that we've already lost, close to a third of our birds in North America in the past 50 years. So the Breeding Bird Atlas will give us so much information about how we can go on to conserve birds. And there are many ways that we can help as young birders to this cause. So yeah, I'm really excited for this event and share how young birders can get involved. So we have two people coming up. We have Alessandra and we have Mike, and I'll just quickly introduce them before we get started. So Alessandra is in her third year of wildlife biology and conservation at the University of Guelph. She started her birding career as a volunteer bander for the Haldimand Bird Observatory in 2014 and has been invested in bird banding ever since. She has always had a passion for birds, exploring the natural world and sharing this knowledge with others. She grew up in Southern Ontario, although she can never stay in one place for too long, and thrives on world travel and exploration. Some of her other interests include painting, flute, and trail running, but these always lead back to birds in one way or another. So Alessandra will be interviewing Mike Cadman, and Mike Cadman has been a songbird biologist for the Canadian Wildlife Service since 1992. Much of his professional life has been devoted to breeding bird atlases. So this is actually the third one. So he's coordinated Ontario's two breeding bird atlas projects. The first one was in 1981 and the second one was in 2001. And he co-edited the resulting books. For the Canadian Wildlife Service, he coordinated the Ontario Forest Bird Monitoring Program and was involved in the development of the Marsh Monitoring Program and has worked extensively on aerial insectivores. So he has co-authored status reports for 5 species at risk and is a member of recovery teams for 4 species at risk. So we have very experienced people over here, and I am really excited to get started. So I'll pass the mic to Alessandra and Mike.
Oh, thank you for that super in-depth introduction. That was great.
Thanks, Caroline.
Okay, so I guess we'll jump right into it with the first question being, what is the Atlas and how does it work?
Okay, well, the Atlas is sort of a giant inventory of the birds of Ontario. You learned in the introduction, it's done every 20 years. It takes 5 years to collect the data because we're really trying to cover the whole province. And the way it works is that it's volunteer driven. Most of the data will be by volunteers, although there's a strong professional involvement as well, basically helping fill in the gaps and fill in places that the volunteers can't get to. And the way it works is we divide the province up into 10 by 10 kilometer squares. Same squares have been there in all the previous atlases. And then the goal, there's about 10,000 of those squares across the province, 2,000 in Southern Ontario. So from Sudbury on south, we're trying to cover every one of those 10 by 10 kilometer squares. And then north of there, we can't cover them all. It's just too vast and remote. And so we're covering a sample of those, probably somewhere between 5% in the areas that we can reach by roads and sort of reasonably accessible. And then the far remote north, we can only get about 2% of the squares done. So then in each one of these 10 by 10 kilometer squares, the idea is to have birders go out and find all the birds that are breeding in that square. And for this atlas, what that involves is getting out in the nesting season, which is mostly in June, but looking for all the birds that they can find that are breeding or displaying evidence of nesting. And so there's an internationally approved series of codes and categories that people use that they go out and look for, and then record those for each of the birds that they're finding in the square. So say a bird is singing in its breeding habitat in the breeding season, that would be a possible breeding bird. and that would go in as such into the database. If you go back a week later and it's still there, then it's a territorial bird, and it would go in as a probable breeder. And then if you were to go back later and find it nest building, or find it feeding young, or even flying around with food in its bill for young, that would confirm it as a nesting bird in that square. So we want to try and get as many of these squares done as we can, and get as much data from each of them as we can. So that gives us a picture of the distribution of each of the species, but then we want to try and get an idea of numbers. So we have a system where people go out and collect information on point counts. And I think Mike's going to explain more about that later, about the details of the point counts, but it's a way of getting an idea of the abundance of the birds, so that we can, again, plot that in this 5-year period and compare that to the previous atlases.
Right, yeah. All right, so how does the atlas contribute to conservation efforts? And would you mind giving an example of how it's been a super important resource?
Yeah, well, the three things that sort of spring to mind: it's very important for species at risk, and
Right.
lots of applications regard species at risk. So the last Atlas, Atlas-2, we had about 10,000 records of species that were considered significant at the time that came in over the course of the Atlas, and then that's all there in the database for people to use. So COSEWIC, the organization that defines the status of birds in Canada, can use that as part of their assessment of the status of each of the species. And the Atlas data is quite useful for that. So a number of the species that were found to be in decline between the first two atlases, and an example would be the barn swallow. And maybe even broader than that, I should mention that the second atlas sort of brought to everybody's attention the fact that the swallows were declining. We noticed these really marked declines, even though they're still quite common birds. They were just showing up in a lot fewer squares than in the previous atlases. And that alerted everybody to this whole problem of the area on insectivores. And then COSEWIC was able to designate several of the species, not just based on the Atlas data, because COSEWIC works right across Canada, but on pulling together all the sources that it could, and define the barn swallow now as a species at risk. And then it starts to put together a recovery strategy for the barn swallow. And the Atlas data is very important for that, because it's up to date, and it shows the sort of current distribution of the birds, but also it allows us to get information on the habitats that the bird use. And so that gets incorporated into defining the critical habitat for the bird, which is, very important in the conservation of the species.
Right, yeah. So so were there any large changes in bird status between Atlas 1 and Atlas 2, and perhaps expected changes for this Atlas, Atlas 3?
Yeah, we were actually quite blown away by the extent of the changes for some species over a 20-year period. Like 20-year, it's not that long a time, but for a lot of these birds, we were quite shocked to see the extent of it. So an example was something like the sandhill crane, which probably was widely distributed originally in Ontario before settlers came in. It's probably a nice, tasty bird. It got shot out, and there weren't any left in southern Ontario. There were the only ones that were around in about 1980 at the time of the first Atlas were up around Sault Ste. Marie and across the North Channel. And there's 1 or 2 records on the Bruce Peninsula that they just moved into there. And so by the time the second Atlas came around, though, they'd expanded right down into much of southern Ontario. They were nesting down at Long Point and Rondo and like the St. Clair Marshes and Pelee, right down in the very southwestern end of the province. Since then, what we're thinking will show with Atlas 3 is that they've really filled in. Right? When they came in, they went to all those prime locations, but now it looks as though they're much more widespread than even they were in Atlas 2. So we actually found that kind of thing happening for a lot of the big birds. The wild turkey was another one. Again, introductions were starting for that one. Again, it had been wiped out by the settlers way back when, but reintroduction started in the early 1980s. And so we just had a handful of records at that time. But by the time Atlas-2 came around, they'd spread right up. They were in most of the squares north to, say, Barrie or Aurelia, and even some squares north of there. And they've continued to expand. So it's going to be really interesting to see just how much they've filled in.
Yeah, okay.
Well, maybe I'll just mention too that some of the other things that were cool, because we're always often talking about declines, but we actually showed quite a lot of birds were increasing. So the birds of prey, bald eagles and the merlin are two in particular that show really extensive changes between the two atlases, where with the banning of the DDT in the 1970s,
yeah, of course.
that really cleaned up the environment for those birds and allowed them to get widely reestablished. And again, with bald eagles, well, with both those species, it's going to be really interesting to see how much that expansions continue.
Right, exactly. So yeah, you get to see like the positive and the negative effects long term, which is super cool. Right, so I'm sure we have a lot of new people with the Atlas. Like I've never done an Atlas before, of course. Like it's been an entire lifetime since the last, for me, the last Atlas occurred.
For you, maybe.
Yeah, for me. But so how can people get involved with the Atlas who are my age, perhaps are new to the entire situation?
Yeah, well, first of all, everyone's welcome to participate in the Atlas. But the thing that we ask, of course, is that you be very careful and make sure that any records that you submit to the project are accurate. And so for really, if people just stick to the birds that they know, then they can submit as many of those as they like. I didn't mention earlier that the way the data collection works this time is via checklists. It's much like eBird, and you just go out and you use an app. The app tracks you and allows you to count the number of birds that you see along the way, as well as recording the breeding evidence. So, if you're newer at this, you're not going to get very many species. It's going to be, but that's going to build over time. So what we encourage is for people to get involved and start working on their skills. And we have some resources on the website to help them with that. Some things that are helpful that, and maybe we'll talk more about that. But the idea is to just get people going, and then hopefully their skills can develop. At the same time, though, there are particular parts of the project that are well suited to people who may not know a lot of birds. We've got a set of standard owl surveys that can be done by anybody. You just got to learn the couple of species that you're surveying for, and you go out. In this case, we're actually starting on in early March, the surveys for the screech owl. And so you go out, you visit a number of preset locations, and then you play a recording of the bird with a set protocol, listen for 5 minutes, and record what you see. What you hear, because you're probably not going to see that much, but often the birds will call back to you. And so you don't have to be a very experienced birder to do that one, but it'll be a really valuable contribution to the project.
Right, yeah. So going off of owl surveys and just general breeding bird surveys, I wanted to kind of discuss the ethics of interacting with wildlife, because of course nesting, breeding is a very sensitive and stressful period of the bird's life. So how could someone get close to songbird nests, and when is it appropriate, if ever, to use playback, especially for the owling surveys, which will occur soon?
Boy, a lot of questions there.
Right. Yeah. Sorry.
So let me start with the playback one.
Right.
So we actually require that people use playback for the standardized surveys. It's a scientifically designed protocol, and people are required to do that. And it undoubtedly bothers the bird that it thinks of somebody invading its territory. But the thing about these points is these are just sort of more or less randomly located spots where you're doing this. And yes, you might bother the bird for the 5 minutes that you're there, but that's it. No one's ever going to be going back to that point again and bothering them. And I guess to some extent, I mean, if in that case, when it's just one visit to a single location like that, it's not much worse than its neighbor coming over and bothering it, or another owl coming in. It's disturbing, yes, and unfortunate, but without that, we really can't get a very good indication of how many of the owls there are around. But
Right.
generally, we're not encouraging people to use playback more generally, especially for species at risk. It's best avoided in most circumstances. Certainly, we don't encourage anybody to go to a spot where there's known to be a bird and using playback there just to bring it out and allow you to have a look at it. Like, that's sort of disturbing the bird unnecessarily, especially if we know that it's already there.
All right, cool.
And then there's other rules. We have some rules in their Atlas materials about how much, if you are going to use playback, that you should only do it for a very short time. You shouldn't do it too loud and that kind of thing, to again try and ensure that the disturbance is minimized.
All right. So what would be the safety protocols for nest searching?
Yeah, well, one thing that I hope was clear earlier, that you can actually confirm breeding quite well from atlasing without necessarily finding nests. And nests are hard to find. And so you can, like a killdeer doing a distraction display for you, that bird would be a confirmed breeder on that checklist and in that square. And you don't have to look for nests beyond that. And a bird carrying food, a robin with a big mouthful of worms, that would confirm breeding for that species on that checklist and in that square. So again, you don't have to look for nests. On the other hand, though, if you can approach nests carefully, there's very useful information to be gained from that. And I think, again, as long as you're careful, visits are made very quickly. You get the information that you want and retreat from the spot quickly. You can get some useful data. And we are affiliated with Birds Canada and their project Nest Watch. We're actually incorporating into the project. So if you do come across a nest, certainly encouraging people to collect information on it, and that'll be very useful for that purpose as well. But overall, it's a relatively minor part of the whole project.
Right. Okay. So throughout the entire discussion, you've been mentioning breeding codes. For the newer birder, or for the people who are new to the Atlas, are there any resources available to help learn and memorize these breeding codes and become familiar with the data collection process?
Yeah, absolutely. For we have on the Atlas website, we haven't mentioned the address for that yet, but it's just birdsontario.org. There, if you go on there, you'll find we call it the Atlas quiz, but it's a breeding evidence quiz. It puts you through your paces. It's really quite a challenging quiz, but it does explain the answers as to when you would record a particular breeding evidence code and how you define each of the categories for breeding. It's fairly straightforward and simple in terms of, it all makes sense. Like a singing bird, you record an S for a singing bird, and that's a possible breeder. Or a nest with eggs is NE, and that's a confirmed breeder. So it doesn't take long to memorize them. They're certainly listed on the website, and they are incorporated right into the app. So when you're using the app, when you click on the app and say, I'd like to enter my breeding evidence now, it pops up all of the different categories, and you just have to click on the one that is appropriate for what you've just seen.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so another question that we actually received from a member of the community, they were wondering what were the best websites and field guides or apps that they could use to improve their skills over the period of the Atlas.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Well, we just love Dendroica, and unfortunately, that's not an easy thing to you got to get the spelling right, but just Dendroica is just Dendroica, and it's a website, and it's really great. It has all the birds in Canada, all the birds in North America, but it has numerous versions of each of the songs of each of the birds, as well as calls. Has numerous photos of each of them. It also has sonograms, which are really helpful if you're trying to learn the song, to listen to the song and look at the sonogram at the same time. You start to see the pattern when it's going up and when it's going down, and just different aspects of the song that come out quite clearly visually. So I really encourage people to use Dendroica. And I should say we're just working with the folks who developed that to provide a whole new element to it, where you'll be able to go on and say, I'm going into a deciduous forest in southwestern Ontario. What birds am I likely to find in there? And then that will obviously help you if you hear some bird in deciduous forest in southern Ontario, you don't know what it is, you can go on there and very quickly find it. So right. Very impressed with Dendroica. For field guides, I love the Sibley guide and would encourage people to use that one. And apps, I don't use that many apps, but I gather Lark Whistle is quite good, but I'm not sure beyond that. Other than that, Merlin is extremely helpful. It's pretty thorough. It has examples, nice pictures of all the birds in all the different plumages, as well as examples of the songs and calls. So
yeah, Merlin has a huge library of calls that you could bring up at any time. I also recommend the Sibley's app. Like Sibley's has an app, and I use it all the time for calls. You can compare different birds and different plumages, and it's super helpful.
Great. I'll have to get one.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit more expensive. I think it's like $20 to $30. I can't remember, but it's definitely a great investment if you're planning on being out in the field all the time.
Yeah, sure. Good to have with you in the field. Obviously, if you hear something, I was thinking about that, and my old Peterson guide. It's not as sophisticated as the Sibley, but it had this nice feature that I used to love. It used to give you little mnemonics for the birds. So like the Canada warbler it's reputed by Peterson to say chip chuppity sweet ditchity. And for some reason that stuck with me my whole life, and it's very easy for me to recognize the Canada warbler song because that little mnemonic is stuck in my head. So I find if you have a chance to have a look at those, there's some really clever little hints there for memorizing bird songs.
Someone in the Instagram chat mentioned, oh, that's Kayla, mentioned apparently the Audubon app is free and is also really good. Ishra said that Raptor ID is good for raptors and it's super detailed. Okay. I just wanted to point those out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about Indigenous involvement because, we need to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have protected and cared for natural areas and sustained them for millennia. And, they have experience, they've had experience with breeding birds since before colonists came. So does the Atlas collaborate with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, very much so. The second Atlas, we actually had sort of 15 different Indigenous communities that were actively involved in the project, mostly in Northern Ontario. And this time, we're hoping we can build on that. This time, we actually have, for the first time, an Indigenous Engagement Committee that's sort of integral to the Atlas. And they've been working now for months in preparation for this. And we have written to all of the communities across Ontario, and responses are starting to come back in, and we're starting to actually begin to make contact and work out how we can work with the communities to take advantage of what they know, to take advantage of their guiding skills, and to help them get involved in the project in ways that are going to be useful to them. Like
right.
A lot of us are new at this, and trying to find out ways that the Indigenous communities would like to get the data, like what is important to them, and how can we incorporate that into the Atlas work that we're doing.
Right, and of course, it's a huge investment as well. It's a huge commitment for people to be involved with this. Even for, well, I mean, it's like you can choose how much you want to be involved. Like how is the commitment for the Atlas?
Yeah, it can range from your total involvement could be that you saw a Canada goose on the pond at the end of your
Right.
street that had babies, and that's all you ever contribute to the Atlas. Or it might be like some people do. Some people put in thousands of hours, and you know, we find once people get going on the Atlas, there was a great deal of excitement about it. We ended up with like 150,000 hours of effort went into the project last time, and we're hoping we can do better than that this time. But it's really up to each individual to figure out how much they want to take part. There's we have there's two sort of groups of atlasers. One is the one that sort of takes responsibility for ensuring that a particular square gets done. So we have a minimum standard of 20 hours of effort that has to go into every square, and with 25 point counts that have to get done in each of those squares. And so people take on that responsibility to make sure that that gets done. They don't necessarily have to do them though. If other people go in there and do a bunch of point counts, all they'll do is just top it up to 25. But then there's another group that are sort of freelance people that aren't necessarily attached to any particular square, and they're like anybody is, but they're welcome to contribute data to any square that they're in the province. And what we're hoping they will do is look for gaps in coverage. The data is going to be coming in on a daily basis. The maps are going to be right up to date on which squares are being covered, which species have been reported in which square. And we're hoping people will say, okay, there's got to be an orchard oriole in that square, and go out and have a good look for it and see if they can find it, and make sure it gets submitted to the project that way. So there's quite a range of ways of people getting involved. And I mentioned those owl surveys, that those are one particular way that they could, but we're going to have special surveys for marsh birds as well. So, you know, it's really up to each individual person how much they want to contribute.
All right. I have a question from Isabel. How would one go about potentially gaining access to trails that are Indigenous protected land?
Okay, well, that's something that we're working with the Indigenous communities on.
Right.
Yeah, and so we actually have an Indigenous engagement coordinator with the project, and now that we're starting to get contact with each of the communities, we're starting to work with them and determine other areas that they do want us or don't want us, and you know, what kind of well, how do we best work with them to get the data that we want, and help them get the data that they're looking for.
All right. Perfect. Okay. So one of the last questions, well, the last question that I wanted to ask you was, are there any concerns with COVID about how to proceed with the Atlas, how to collect data?
Yeah, very much. Just terrible timing, of course, for the Atlas. The timing for the Atlas has been set for a long time, and along comes COVID. And so, it, of course, there's a great deal of concern about COVID. And so we as an Atlas are wanting to ensure that the participants in the project are paying full attention, very close attention to the rules in their region of the province, and encouraging everybody before they go out atlasing to look on the Atlas website. We have a note there about just that very thing, but about finding out what the rules and regulations are in your area and being sure you keep to them.
All right. So yeah, so that's all the questions I wanted to ask you. There doesn't appear to be any other questions. So perhaps we could transition to the more in-depth interview. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
No, other than just thanks for this opportunity, and also just thanks to everybody out there who does eventually participate in the project. I'm really looking forward to working with you on it. And there is, I didn't really talk about it, but it is a lot of fun to do,
Yeah.
to do the Atlas. eBird's wonderful. I do a lot of eBirding too, but this provides a whole structure to your birding. This idea of filling in gaps and making sure that we get good coverage for all of the species, and seeing those gaps fill in as we as the whole birding community work together is really an exciting thing. I love being part of it, and I hope a lot of the folks will join us.
Yeah, and of course the structure of it all really helps to develop your skills over the years. If you're always following the same protocol, you'll get used to doing the same things and improving your identification and so on.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. So, Caroline, did you want to introduce the next
group? Sure. Yeah, thank you, Alessandra, and thanks, Mike, for giving that good in-depth introduction to the Atlas. So now we are getting more into the nitty-gritty, into the details. So if you want to know all the logistical things and just more technical aspects of the Atlas, then stick around. And talking about that will be Mike Burrell and young birder Ezra Campanelli. And so Mike Burrell is a birder and naturalist. He's an experienced trip leader for the Ontario Field Ornithologists, and he's also the co-author of the book Best Places to Bird in Ontario, and he's also involved in the Atlas. And I'll just quickly introduce Ezra as well. So Ezra is a birder from Hamilton, but his birding adventures take him all over the province and beyond. As a kid, he developed a love for birds and nature on walks and bike rides with his family, and his passion was nurtured through photography, the encouragement of birding friends, and banding and surveying opportunities at the Haldimand Bird Observatory. Ezra works as an audio technician for SNC-Lavalin, identifying bird vocalizations from field recordings. He is thrilled to be involved with the Breeding Bird Atlas, and he's excited to help introduce people to the project. So welcome, Ezra and Mike. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey everyone. Yeah, how's it going? I hope this segment of the seminar is not terribly dry, because it is going to get a little more nitty gritty, but hopefully there'll be a lot of helpful information, and Mike is a treasure trove of that, so I have no doubt that will be the case. I don't know, I guess, Mike, if you're ready, I'll jump into the first few questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So Mike and Alessandra were talking about the breeding codes for breeding bird evidence. So I was thinking we could go in a bit more thoroughly and discuss those codes, maybe point out a few especially tricky ones, and yeah, just kind of explain what exactly they mean, and just give people a good idea of that.
Yeah, sure. So Mike talked about breeding codes a bit, and they're really sort of the basis for the data collection for the Atlas. So we assign breeding evidence codes to one of three levels when we see it. So they go from possible breeding evidence to probable to confirmed. So as you can hear, they go from less sure that the species is breeding to you're totally sure the species is breeding in that square. And then within each of those three categories, they're broken down further. There's about 5 or 6 different categories within each of those categories. So this sort of lowest level of breeding evidence would be things like you see a bird in its breeding season in breeding habitat. That's the H code, and all the breeding codes. There's a list of the codes and what they mean right on the Atlas under the resources tab. There's, Mike already mentioned, there's the breeding evidence quiz. And so there's like over 100 questions that you can quiz yourself on. So you can spend a good chunk of time quizzing yourself on different scenarios and which code would be properly used. But then Mike also mentioned that when you're doing the data entry itself, whether it's on the app or on the website, it does list the codes and it gives a sort of short definition of what it is. So you don't have to memorize them right off the top of your head. You always have some sort of mental crutch there to help you. But yeah, they go from the less confident that the species is breeding to the more confident. And what we really are hoping is to confirm as many species in each square as possible. And so you can do that by finding nests, but as Mike said, there's lots of other ways that there's lots of other codes that you can use that qualify as confirmed. So the easiest time of year really for confirming species is usually after the birds are out of the nest or just as they're about to leave. when the adults are really busy feeding them. So if you can find an adult carrying food, that's often one of the easiest ways to confirm a species as nesting in the square.
It seems a bit daunting almost to find confirmed breeding evidence. So do you have any like tips or tricks? I know it varies with different species, but that was a good thing you mentioned about like time of year to find the majority of active breeding birds. But do you have any other tips and tricks to find confirmed breeding evidence?
Yeah, well, so I think one of the really fun things about the Atlas is it forces you to, if you really want to get into it, it forces you to really pay close attention to the behavior of birds. So a lot of us, when we're doing our normal birding, we don't spend as much time with an individual bird as you probably will when you start atlasing. And it really helps you appreciate all the stuff that birds are up to when you pay close attention to them. And that's really the number one tip. If you want to confirm a species breeding in an area, just stay on it, keep watching it. So if it's the breeding season and you see, like a great crested flycatcher, instead of just, seeing it and saying, yeah, check, got great crested flycatcher, just sit quietly. And it's amazing once you get quiet and you follow a bird closely, it's amazing what you might find. And if it's the breeding season, eventually it's going to head to a nest if it's got a nest, or it'll exhibit some other interesting breeding behavior. But just sitting back and watching is the number one tip for sure.
Yeah, totally. Like I've noticed that just in the limited atlasing I've been able to do at the beginning of this year, looking for owls, which are one of the few, we'll get into this a bit later, but are one of the few breeders during the earlier winter months. And as a lister myself, as I think a lot of birders in the province are, it's so easy to just, as you were saying, check a bird off a list and move on. But you really do gain a deeper appreciation for birds when you are, you're not just about looking for different species, but you're looking to see their behaviors and all of that. So yeah, I would definitely second the points that Mike is saying. I'll move on to the second question. Safe dates are a big thing when it comes to finding or documenting birds for the Atlas. So could you explain what safe dates are and kind of some protocol around that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, you're asking about the safe dates. And so what a safe date is, it's really a time of year when, based on the species biology, if you observe it during that time period, then we can be sure, we can be relatively sure that that species is in fact breeding. So basically, we look at a species in an area, and when we come up with, okay, what is the time of year when that species is breeding, and that goes right from when the males arrive and try to attract females, to nest building, to laying eggs, raising, feeding the young leave the nest, and then there's some period afterwards where the young are still dependent on the adults. So that's sort of the entire breeding season for that species. So we take the breeding season, and then we also look at, okay, what time of year is that species also migrating through or exhibiting non-breeding behavior. And most species, there's sort of the spring migration period, then they breed, then there's the fall migration period, and there's a little tiny bit of overlap between the last spring migrants going through and the start of the breeding season. And then again, at the end of the summer, there'd be a bit of overlap between the last of that species that's still breeding to when the first fall migrants are moving through. So the safe date is the time of the year when basically there's no migrants around. So we've got a really handy set of calendar charts on the website under the resources tab, which shows the breeding season as well as the migration dates, and then it highlights what are the safe dates in there. And it's important to note that you can record breeding evidence outside of the safe dates, and even outside of the breeding season. It's just when you do that, we're asking you to provide extra sort of documentation, extra rationale for how you know that is a breeding record. So if you see if you see American robin right now, if you look at the safe dates chart, you'll see that, okay, we're still a little before the breeding season has even begun. So it's probably not a breeder. Don't record breeding evidence for that species. But, if it's later on into late May or June, then it's safe to assume that if you see a robin in Southern Ontario, then it's probably a breeder.
Yeah, awesome. And that chart you mentioned, I thought it would be worth pointing out that it's split up into the different zones, so where the different safe dates are applicable. So that helps. I'm sure a lot of us will be in the the plains.
Yeah, it's broken into the 3 major eco zones of Ontario. So the Mixedwood Plains is basically Southern Ontario, south of the Canadian Shield, which is where most Ontarians live, but there's still a fair number of us that are in the next one up, the Boreal Shield, which covers most of the province. And then there's a 3rd ecozone, the Hudson Bay Plains, which has a few communities, but mostly it's people going to be visiting that area. And not surprisingly, the dates sort of shift later into the year as you go further north in the province.
Yeah, that's definitely a great resource to have. I know I have all those very helpful resources just bookmarked on my phones, and I access them in Biel all the time just to run data collection. Sorry, and I've moved locations. I thought I mentioned. I hope the audio is a bit better because I've gotten word that it was a bit echoey on the Instagram live feed, but let me know, please. Anyway, I'll move on to the next question. Yeah, so it's super helpful this year that we have an app in order to record all of this data. Before, I guess it was mostly paper and online entry. But could you explain, I know Mike C did touch on it a bit in the first segment of the presentation, but could you explain kind of the process of using that app? And then we might get a bit more into detail on that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's awesome. We've got a dedicated app. It's still sort of in its infancy. It's gonna have more bells and whistles added, probably imminently, but I suspect through the life of the Atlas, the next 5 years, it'll constantly get upgraded, as most apps do. The first version that'll be out in the next couple months, hopefully, it will have things like built-in tracking and effort data. So it's super easy to use. You basically just say start a checklist, and Mike mentioned that all the data collected is on a checklist basis. So basically you need to tell the app where you are, but if you're using the app, it will already know that based on the GPS built in. So as long as you enable that on the app, then you don't even need to tell it where you are. It'll do that for you. Once the tracking is live, it's currently just being tested, but it should be out soon. Then it'll also keep track of where you go on that checklist, and it'll also record what was the start time and obviously the date. And then so all you need to worry about is the birds that you're encountering, whether it's by sound or sight. And individual of that species, you can just add a check, basically add to the total number of individuals observed on that checklist, and then you record the breeding evidence, and you record the highest level of breeding evidence that you encounter for that species for that checklist. So if you see a singing black-capped chickadee, you could record the S, and if you don't know the breeding codes, as I said, they'll pop up with the definitions. But then later on, as you're recording that checklist, if you then encounter a pair of chickadees, that are acting as a pair, maybe from the behavior you're observing, it's a pair, then you could upgrade that breeding evidence code to P for pair. And maybe later, then you see them bringing food to a nest, so then you can upgrade it again. But on that individual checklist, you're going to have a list of species you observed, how many individuals, and what the highest level of breeding evidence was for each species. And then when you click stop the checklist, with the tracking, once that's live, then it'll calculate how far you walked or drove, how long you were out for, and then you just have to submit it. And you'll occasionally get prompted to add details for things like rare species and things like that. But it's pretty similar to the eBird app, if for people that are familiar with that.
Yeah, and is it possible to use if you're offline, if you're not connected to data, can you still record the location and information of a checklist?
Yeah, good question. I can't remember if that's working quite yet on the public version that's out, but on that's a major feature that will be out there. It should be out before the start of this season really gets underway. So yeah, the idea would be that you could be in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, but you can record all the data you need. It'll record, the GPS still works even if you're out of cell signal. It'll have downloaded, when you turn on the app the first time, it'll have downloaded all the data it needs. And then you'll just have to save that checklist and submit it once you're back into cell service or Wi-Fi.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, and you mentioned how it's similar to eBird. So for eBird users, I understand there's a way of linking your data on the NatureCounts app to your eBird data. Is that correct? And how would one do that?
Yeah, so you've got to do it right now through the website. So you have to go onto the Atlas website on birdsontario.org. You've got to log in, so you need to have your login credentials, and then it's just under your personal settings. I think it's called preferences, but there's a spot there to enter your eBird login credentials, so your username and password for eBird. And then there's also an option that lets you automatically sync your data. So it's a handy feature to do that, but you have to be cautious, if you're going to recording things for the Atlas that you wouldn't necessarily want to put onto eBird. So things like, sensitive species or, exact locations of nests and things like that. You need to be aware that it's going to go right away straight to eBird. So if you're worried about that, I'd recommend people uncheck the automatic checkbox, and then you can do it manually, one checklist at a time, and it's really great. All your Atlas lists, you'll be able to view them when you go into the website. You can view all your lists, and there's a little icon beside each one to show you whether or not it's shared with eBird already. So you can really quickly click on the ones that haven't been shared, and there's a little button when you're viewing one of your existing checklists to share it into your eBird account if you don't have the automatic sharing.
Yeah, and once it is submitted, can you go on your eBird checklist and edit that without it changing on the Atlas for the Atlas data? Just in case, say you want to add a species of bird that didn't display breeding evidence or something like that.
Yeah, well, so first of all, you absolutely can enter those birds into the Atlas checklist. So, if I'm atlasing right now, this time of year, there's not a lot that's going to have breeding evidence, but I could be out looking for owls or, there's a handful of species that are breeding right now. So I could be looking for those, and you should still record all the birds that you see while you're atlasing in the Atlas checklist. You just wouldn't put any breeding evidence code for those things. So like if you saw like a common redpoll right now, you're out atlasing and you see a common redpoll, it's they go breed in the Hudson Bay lowlands in Ontario. They're not going to breed in southern Ontario. So you should put those redpolls in the checklist, just don't put breeding evidence. But go back to your original question. Yeah, you can absolutely edit. You can edit your eBird list. Any edits you make in eBird, they won't go automatically back into the checklist, but there is an option to bring it back if you choose to.
Yeah, that's super handy. Yeah, a question from my friend Quinton. He wanted to know what is a point count, and then you can go into a bit of detail about the play-by-play of what happens on a point count.
Yeah, cool. So point counts are a really useful but also very simple bird survey technique, and we use them in North America. We use them for all sorts of different bird monitoring programs. So the Atlas is one of the programs that uses point counts, but lots of other programs use them, like the Breeding Bird Survey. It's really a very basic way of surveying birds in a standardized way. So the exact details of a point count can vary, but they're really powerful because they allow us to look at all sorts of things, like abundance. So in Atlas 2, we did point counts for the first time. We didn't have point counts as part of Atlas-1, but in Atlas-2, I think it was like 65,000 point counts were conducted around the province. And that really allowed us to come up with information that was at such a finer resolution than we had in Atlas-1, especially things like relative abundance of a species across the province. But in terms of what exactly a point count is, they can really vary. So for the Atlas, we have them set up as a 5-minute point count. But they can be, the breeding bird survey does 3-minute point counts. Some programs have them set up as 10-minute point counts. Sometimes you'll split the time partway through. So for Atlas-3, I think the plan is that you will have the option to split them, the time. I don't think it's going to be a requirement, but I could be wrong on that. We're still ironing out all the exact details, and we'll have a detailed manual out. But basically, what you would do is you'd get to a predetermined location where the point count is going to take place, and you're going to record all the birds you can see or hear over the course of the point count. So it could be the 5-minute point count, and sometimes you record which species were inside or outside a certain distance. So, like for instance, is it closer than 100 meters or further than 100 meters? And the idea is really to just get a real quick snapshot of what the birds are that are there. And to do point counts, you do have to be a little more experienced because most of it is birding by ear. You can imagine in a 3 or 5 minute period, if you're going to try to identify all the birds that are around, you really need to know your songs and calls quite well.
Yeah, that sounds just like a very, as you were saying, like a very specific data that is going to go into the Atlas database. So that's super helpful. Yeah, and they were mentioning earlier, Alessandra and Mike C were mentioning earlier about good resources to use for learning about birds, field guides and whatnot. And I thought now's a good time to bring up Larkwire, because we're talking about bird vocalizations. Yeah, Larkwire is a super good app and site or you can access it on mobile and desktop, but it gives you little quizzes on birds from different regions. And personally, I've gained a wealth of knowledge from that, and it's really helped. But I guess the best way is to learn in the field, but you can transfer that knowledge pretty well there. Yeah, I just thought I'd point that out. Yeah, I guess we'll move on. A lot of people have been asking about job opportunities, maybe through CWS or BSc. Could you shed light on that at all?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that at this point. Everything's still fairly up in the air from my understanding. But certainly in the last Atlas, there was a fair number of opportunities to work on field crews and things like that. But I'm not sure where we're at yet, but there will certainly be some job opportunities, if not this year, in other seasons of the 5 years of the data collection.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem. But I guess, yeah, just keep your ear to the ground if that's something that would interest you. Yeah, I guess briefly, because it is the early stages of the year, I mean, spring is starting to come back in small waves, but as you say, there's not a lot of birds that are breeding this time of year, but for things like owls and crossbills that are opportunistic breeders, and even rock pigeons, those are things that we can that show breeding evidence this time of year. The first segment was already talking about how to find owls, but crossbills is something that would interest people a lot. How would you recommend going about finding breeding evidence of those species, the red and white-winged crossbills that have made a kind of influx into Southern Ontario?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I'll point out there's an Atlasing articles tab under the resources on the website. And there's a really great crossbill article on there that Mark Peck wrote. And it goes into way more detail than I'm going to be able to go into in the next couple of minutes. But if you're really interested in finding crossbills, definitely find that article. I don't know, maybe we can put a link. I don't know. I guess you can't put links on Instagram usually. But it's on the website. under resources. So for crossbills, it's a really exciting year because they came south so much, and this might be the only year of the 5 years that we have an opportunity to find crossbills breeding in Southern Ontario. They usually stick more onto the shield. So we're hoping to take advantage. There's been a couple confirmed records already. So definitely something for people to keep an eye out for. And as you say, they're kind of an interesting species because they nest so early in the year. Most of our species are nesting in like May and June and July, but crossbills will nest any time of the year. So the key for crossbills is they need food. And so the white-winged crossbills, they are mostly going to eat spruce seeds from spruce cones or tamarack cones. The red crossbill, there's all these different call types, so they'll feed on different conifers. Some of them are more into spruce and some of them are more into pine. So in Southern Ontario, you want to be looking for conifer plantations. If you've got a good plantation, keep an eye on the cone crops. If there's no cones, then they're probably not going to have any crossbills breeding. So if you find a plantation that's got lots of cones, then keep going back to it. Keep an eye out for it. And listen for them to be singing. So the first step of their breeding cycle will be the males will set up little territories. They're barely real territories, but they'll set up shop and they'll have a pretty long, elaborate song. It's a very pretty song in both species. They'll use that to attract females. So that's the easiest breeding evidence to find, I guess. If you can find singing crossbills, that's the best start. Once they start mating and building nests, then they get a little more secretive. So you gotta look a little harder to find them. So that's tougher. But if you can find the males singing, that's probably your best bet. And don't waste your time on deciduous woodlots or conifer areas with lots of conifers if there's no cones, because they won't be nesting.
Right. Yeah, that's really good to know. Personally, I haven't had a lot of luck with crossbills yet, but I'll keep looking. Yeah, something that, and I just got a note here from Mike Cadman. He said that, just to go back to the previous question, that the Atlas will be hiring students every summer and just to watch the Atlas and Birds Canada website. So I thought that was important to mention. But yeah, the next thing I was going to ask you about, which really interests me, is access to private property. A lot of these squares possibly located where there aren't a lot of publicly accessible trails or bird hotspots. And of course, you want to be as thorough as possible. So is there any moves being made about how Atlasers can access property that is private, possibly coordinating with property owners and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I'll say is you should absolutely not, don't consider the Atlas an excuse or a license to go onto private property. You have to respect property owners, and the best approach really is, to knock on doors. This right now with COVID, maybe it's a little trickier. So it's a bit trickier right now, but if we were in a normal year, I would say go knock on the door, tell them what you're up to, give them a phone call. Most people are pretty excited, especially if it's a younger person, telling them they're interested in birds, and you can offer to tell them what's on their property, things like that. That's probably the best approach. For other, if it's something like a nature conservancy or some sort of private nature reserve, you might consider going through the regional coordinator for the area, asking them if they have any contact leads, or they might have already reached out to like the organization and arrange something. So probably best to check with your regional coordinator for the area, especially if it's an organization owned property. But if it's just somebody's woodlot or farm field or something like that, and it's absolutely, you need to go and talk with the owner and and get permission. But in a lot of cases, my experience is they're really excited to have somebody come in and tell them what's on their property.
Yeah, no, totally. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but you said maybe knocking on doors will be like a bit trickier during, you know, the time that we're in, but maybe would it be a good idea to put letters in their mailbox with your contact info? Might that be helpful?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I think we're, all right, we got disconnected there, but I think we're back. Just to pick up where we were at there, Ezra, yeah, in terms of accessing private property, there will be a letter. It'll be up on the website where you can add your name and contact information. So you can stick that in mailboxes or stick it in the mail. And you're not going to get 100% response, but hopefully you get a pretty good response rate, and you can get access to survey some of the private property you wouldn't otherwise be able to get to.
Yeah, that's really good to know, because otherwise I think there'll be a lot of just birding by ear from roadsides, but you know, that'll hone your skills too. But yeah, this would be really helpful if you could, you know, with permission, access people's properties. Yeah, Dennis is asking, will Atlas info be shared with local conservation authorities?
Yeah, so the great thing about the Atlas, the data is really meant for everybody to use. So there's whether it's local conservation authorities, provincial government, federal government, environmental non-government organizations, and even researchers and individuals. It's a real huge resource for all of us to be able to make informed decisions about you know, small scale, large scale management, land management decisions, about species management decisions. Mike mentioned how important the data is for informing like species at risk designation. So yeah, absolutely, the data is not meant to be, you know, squirreled away in a little box that nobody ever sees. It's meant to better conserve our birds.
Yeah, totally. For the final thing I wanted to ask you, it's kind of a two-parter, but are there any specific goals for different parts of the province? And if you are a birder who lives in one part of the province but want to contribute to the data elsewhere, of course you can Atlas anywhere in the province, but are there any specific opportunities that would be presented, like Atlas-oriented opportunities that would be open to birders in different parts of the province?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, we do have specific targets for, you know, minimum number of squares that get point counts done, minimum number of hours of atlasing that get done, and it varies depending on where you are in the province. You know, it's highest, the goals are highest in southern Ontario where there's the most people, and they're the lowest further north where access is much more difficult and there's fewer people to survey. So there will definitely be opportunities to go elsewhere. If you're based in southern Ontario, there will be opportunities to go north. You know, it could be on your own, go and do some atlasing, do an atlasing trip. And you might be able to connect with one of the regional coordinators in the north to, you know, get pointed at a particular area that is in need of coverage. They might be able to set you up with some particular resources or suggest places where you might be able to stay. And then there will be things like square bashes, which are so much fun. The idea with a square bash is you invite a whole bunch of people to come, you know, maybe stay at a campground somewhere, and over the course of a weekend or 3 days or something, you get a whole bunch of people come in, a whole bunch of atlasers come in, and, you know, you divide and conquer, and you might cover off 5 or 6 squares, or even just a single square over a weekend, and, you know, you get a whole bunch of coverage over a short amount of time. So square bashes will be organized for sure, and then there will be opportunities in the further north doing things like canoe trips, and maybe even fly-in trips and things like that. But those are all based on or dependent on resources that we don't know what we'll have yet. So it's early for us on those, and especially with COVID, there probably won't be any work done in the real far north this summer. Just just because it's just extra complicated this year. But certainly in years 2 to 5, we'll have some interesting opportunities.
Yeah, personally, that's all sounds super exciting to me, and I'm sure to everyone tuning in. Yeah, I guess that'll close off our part of it. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone tuning in has too. So, Mike, and I think Caroline is gonna close us out. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ezra. Great
No
questions.
problem.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think that those are all the questions. I definitely learned a lot about the Atlas. And yeah, if you have any additional questions, there's a lot of info on the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas website. So you can just type that into Google, check out the website. And if you still have any unanswered questions, there is an Instagram page for the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. So if you have any additional questions that you didn't have a chance to get answered here, then you can always send them a message. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Mike and Ezra, and also Alessandra and the other Mike, for answering all these questions. And yeah, I'm looking forward to getting involved in the Atlas this year. Yeah, thank you all for joining and listening. Yeah, all right. So, and sorry for the interruption before. Yeah, thank you. All right, have a good evening, everyone.